So I just finished the series finale of 12 Monkeys. I'm going to talk about time travel a bit. At the end of the video, I'll put a link in the description for the timestamp. If you just want to hear about the show, don't really care about all the time travel stuff, just skip there. The time travel stuff, I'm going to try to keep the specifics about the show to a minimum and try to talk about it generally. So even if you haven't watched all 4 seasons of the show, you still should be able to follow along and really understand some time travel concepts. Especially, I figured out people talk about time loops a lot. And on the show, the villains, they want to create the Red Forest, which is basically a place without time, a place where there's no death, and there's this kind of sense of creating a time loop, and we get all this poetry about a snake eating its own tail. I've finally figured out, I think, a really good way to kind of visualize what a time loop would actually look like. Now, since time travel is possible, you can say, hey, I remember 2 years ago, I was at this place, I'm going to travel back in time to that place, I'm going to have a conversation with another version of myself. Now, on 12 Monkeys, at least a TV show, these 2 different versions that have a conversation with each other, and we see this multiple times on the show, these 2 different versions have different lives. So in some sense, they are 2 different versions with 2 different life paths, and they come into contact, they have a conversation, but this interaction only happens once. So they come into contact, and on the show there's an old version and there's a younger version, and they have this conversation, but the old version, she didn't have the conversation as a younger version, and the younger version, she's not going to grow up and eventually have that same exact interaction, but now the roles are reversed, and she's now the old version having a conversation with the younger self. This interaction, it only takes place once. Now, you see how this doesn't create a time loop, because everyone has their lifelines, and they go out, and they might cross other versions of themselves, but there's no recursion, there's no these things happening over and over and over again. Now, on Dark, great time travel show, it's different. So we have one of the main characters on the show, he has an interaction with an older version of himself. Now the big difference is that older version of himself, he's already had the same interaction, except he was the younger version. And this younger version that we're following, we know that he's gonna grow up, and eventually have the same exact interaction, except now he's gonna be the older person. So I'm going to show you on a diagram just what this kind of looks like. So if we look at any particular instance of our character, we know that he's going to meet with, and his lifeline's going to cross with the lifeline of another version of himself twice. We know that it's going to happen once when his life is just beginning. So it's at the start of his line, and someone else's line, because he's the older version, is towards the end. We also know it's going to happen again when he's now at the end of his line, and the person he's crossing with, the version of himself he's crossing with, is just at the beginning. So we can draw this for one version, then we can go to another version on our diagram, and we can do the same thing. We know that it's going to cross once when he's at the beginning and another version is at the end, and we know that it's going to cross again when he's at the end and another version is at the beginning. So if we keep drawing, for each line, we know each of these lines on our diagram is a version of this character, and we know each line has to have these 2 crossings. We see that we're going to get a structure that never ends. And if you try to find the first instance, if you try to find the chicken or the egg, you can't. Now you may think, well, what does it matter finding the first? Who cares? But find the last. When is this sequence going to end? It's never going to end, because each new interaction, you're going to have a young version of Jonah, and he's going to grow up, and eventually we know as soon as he has this interaction as a younger version, he's going to have to grow up and have the same interaction as an older version. And for him to have this interaction as an older version, he now needs a new younger self to have this interaction. That younger self is going to grow up, become an older version, and need to have that same interaction, and going to create a new younger self. So you're going to be stuck in a time loop that's going to go on forever. And if the time loop is where you lose the love of your life or the supervillain wins, you can see how this could be problematic. And understand that for each instance of yourself, it may not feel like eternity, because you do grow up and you do die, but there's always another version of yourself coming that is going to have the exact same experiences. And this is where the sense of being an old soul, kind of deja vu, that can come into play. Okay, so that's by far the hardest, most confusing concept. The other concepts I'll talk about, way easier to understand. One's the Bootstrap Paradox, or the Predestination Paradox. On the show, the Army of the 12 Monkeys, it's a cult, and the cult, they do everything in their power to bring about the witness, who's their messiah. Now, you'd say, well, and now this is my question, where did the cult of the 12 monkeys start? Like, who came up with this idea? Well, what happened was the witness, after the cult brought the witness into being, the witness then traveled back in time, 1950s I think it was, and just started recruiting people and spreading his message. So in this case, you can say what happened first or what caused the other. And there's this sense of causality where things cause another thing and another thing, and it eventually loops back. So causality in this case is a circle, and you can never find a first cause, and you can never find the ultimate first cause of something because everything's inextricably linked. And you could say, well, the army of the 12 monkeys, that came first. But for the army of the 12 monkeys to exist, first the witness had to come into being, go back in time, and start recruiting followers. So obviously the witness came first, but there was a time where the witness didn't exist and the army of the 12 monkeys was doing everything in its power to try to bring him into being. And there's lots of other examples of this on the show. Most famous is it takes time travel to create time travel. So a time traveler goes back in time and then funds the research project that results in time travel. So again, what comes first? What causes the other? And it's interesting because when you get to these questions of what comes first, us watching the show, we're fed the events in a certain order. So we may give our answer based on which events the creators of the show happen to give us in what order. There's also the question, well, obviously whatever came first in time. 1950 is before 2047, so obviously 1950 comes first. But then there's also the sense of each individual, they're going to experience their life in a certain order, and depending on how they travel through time, they may experience events in 1950 way after events in 2040, depending on how they jump around in time. So you start to see there's different ways that people experience time and different ways that they're going to say one thing comes before the other. And then last thing I want to talk about, self-fulfilling prophecy. What's really interesting is how this is connected to another thing we often see in time travel, where you go back in time, try to stop something, and you realize that it's actually you traveling back in time and trying to stop it that causes the thing to begin with. We see a bit of this in the show 12 Monkeys, not so much. We see this more in the movie 12 Monkeys, Terminator, Time Traveler's Wife, lots of other shows. It's a very popular, I don't think there's a name for it, but it's very popular trope. Now, what's similar to this idea is something that doesn't have to do with time travel at all, is something called a self-fulfilling prophecy. So in the show, I talked about the witness, this prophet. He was told by his cult, his followers, as a boy, you're the witness, it's your destiny to bring about the Red Forest, destroy time. And he rebelled against this and didn't want to follow it, but then he fell in love, the love of his life died, and suddenly he's like, oh no, look at myself, I've lost the love of my life, I want to bring about eternity, kill death, look, the prophecy is true, I'm becoming the witness. And then you can say, well, it's my destiny, what can I do? I guess I just have to become the witness. Now, this is a great example of when you're told something and you're told a prophecy, then all the events that take place in your life that may have nothing to do with this prophecy, you're going to now have confirmation bias, and everything that occurs is going to lead you to associate it with that prophecy and say, well, look, I guess the prophecy is right. Then as soon as you think the prophecy is right, you become fatalistic and you can say, well, what can I do? It's a prophecy. So I liked the show. I really did like it. I have some criticisms, which I'll get to, but first I'll start with the positive stuff. The characters are fantastic. It was great casting, great performances. You really did grow to love them. Even a few characters who initially you weren't quite sure of season one, everyone completely grew on you. There was a great mix of enough different characters where there were some that were absolutely evil, some that were kind of anti-heroes, kind of on that edge where you weren't sure, and some that had conflicted. They were good characters, but they had these factors that made them susceptible to potentially being manipulated by evil. So it really was unpredictable. Sometimes you didn't know which direction, which alliances were going to form. It was so much fun. They had so much fun with the show. They would go around. With a time traveling show, you have this great opportunity to have these characters that you love go back in time, put on costumes, do different stuff, and they did it so well. It was always fun when they went around in time and you saw the characters in the different outfits. Some stuff that shouldn't have worked but did when they went back in time and she sang "You in Your Hand" in front of the fascists, like that moment, and then they blew up Hitler. That moment shouldn't have worked, but the fact that it did work just showed how much they'd really built up some great characters and some great great buy-in with the audience that they could pull off a scene like that. So the show was a ton of fun, had some really fun cameos as well. If you know the show Impractical Jokers, first they brought on one of them, Q, and it was hilarious because they brought him on a speed dating, and there was a hilarious challenge where he had to do a whole speed dating thing just with these huge chicken wings in his hand, so that was funny. And then they brought back every single Impractical Joker throughout the show. It was great. And the love stories, I thought they were handled great as well. I was surprised. The comedy they did really well. The love story angle was really great. Now, as far as the mythology and the world building and the time travel stuff, it was hit or miss. So I feel like with the time travel, at times they struck a really good balance between being faithful to logic and the rules of time travel and adding some really cool kind of poetic aspects. I thought the part with some people being born primary, kind of like prime numbers, and them having this special role with respect to time and paradoxing them, causing all these problems. That was a really interesting addition that I've never seen with any kind of time travel story before, so that really worked. And the mythology, I thought, up until about the end of season 2, I thought it was fantastic, this idea that the plague was released so someone would get motivated to invent time travel so they could then grab time travel and use it to paradox all these primaries that cause problems with the fabric of time itself. That was really good, and that was interesting. And up until season 2 and the end of season 2, that season finale where we get this great dream surreal sequence of them at the house together, and we see this juxtaposed with this slaughter at Titan, and he has this interaction that we still don't really get explained with that woman in the insane asylum. It was just fantastic, and everything was working, everything was firing on all cylinders. Some of the spectacles and the visuals, the imagery was great. So many sketches, so many drawings, at Titan, everyone wearing the robes. It was just fantastic imagery. So where it started to, I think, come awry was just the mythology. It just got too all over the place. It didn't come together, it didn't congeal. The addition of the Guardians, where they would go back in time, fix the problem that occurred 15 minutes ago, and then self-destruct, I just didn't understand, because we'd seen our heroes interact with future versions of themselves all the time. We saw this throughout the show, and the future versions never had to self-destruct. I guess the Guardians and them are on opposite sides, but the Guardians are the one who want to create paradoxes, and they want to cause problems for time. Our heroes are the ones who want to kind of put time back how it is, so why the Guardians would have to self-destruct and the heroes didn't, that was just one example of just the mythology getting so convoluted, so hard to follow. The logic of time travel, I think the fact that they didn't really have tight rules really started to show, and it did take away from my enjoyment of the show a little bit, just because I think 12 Monkeys as a movie, very underrated, and really did was good about following the laws of time travel and being a great time travel movie. So I think that they had a bit of they should have really worked hard to get the time travel aspect down, and I think that it got away from them just a little bit. And third and fourth season, there were moments of brilliance, like I say with the you and your hand moment. I thought that was a great episode. I loved that episode that ended with the cover of Don't You Forget About Me. Just some really great moments in season 4. So it wasn't a terrible season or even a bad season, but I think that season 2 was the peak for me. But again, the writing, the quotes, the imagery they used, the symbols was good throughout. Some of the mythology was strong throughout. The whole idea of Olivia as this very tragic, unloved child who brought about all of this just because she was scared of death, because she was scared of not necessarily loss, but just being alone and nothingness, because she knew what that felt like and how painful it was. I thought that really worked. I'm trying to put my finger on what didn't quite work the last couple seasons for me. It was just too many funny names, too many people coming back from the dead, too many weird gadgets with the time vest, too many times where people met future versions of themselves. It just became more and more outlandish, and again, so different than the movie. I thought what was beautiful about the movie was you thought there was this sinister, crazy conspiracy, and it turned out that the true story was much more ordinary and yet incredibly consistent and obeying the laws of time travel. So it had this kind of beautiful simplicity. Here, I feel like as the seasons went on and on, the mystery and the story just became more and more outlandish and over the top, and more not obeying any laws of anything and making any kind of sense. So it did just take away from it a bit. But like I said, I think the show, it was at its strongest when it was having fun, not taking itself too seriously, playing a little fast and loose, taking some creative liberties with time travel. So maybe it wasn't a perfect finale or perfect last season, but maybe it was a fitting one.